Sigoli Swagwake. Yauko for tuning in to Deep Roots in Democracy. We have an amazing panel speaking on two very important issues. We'll be talking about how Native American communities in Wisconsin have been gerrymandered and the importance of the Native American vote. My name is Justice Pache. I'm an organizer with Wisconsin Conservation Voice's Native Vote program, and I'll be moderating the discussion. I'd like to start out by giving a short disclaimer. Wisconsin Conservation Voices is a nonpartisan, nonprofit 501c3, and we're putting this on for educational purposes. So to talk about gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is when politicians in power draw their voting maps in an unfair way to give themselves an advantage. Voters are supposed to be choosing their politicians, but when maps are gerrymandered, it's the opposite. Politicians are choosing their voters. As of now, this is completely legal in Wisconsin, and Native American communities around the state have had their voting maps gerrymandered. To speak on this, we have a panel of Native American leaders from around the state. We have Patti Brzezinski, who was a key member of the Menominee Offense-Defense Legal Committee, fighting for restoration of the Menominee Nation, and she's an instructor at the College of Menominee Nation. We have Joe Miller, who has more than 20 years of experience on the Stockbridge-Muncie Tribal Council. He's serving his second term on Shawano's County Board of Supervisors and his 8th term on the Bowler School Board. Lance Kelly, who's an instructor at the Northeastern Wisconsin Technical College. Lance ran for Hobart's Board of Trustees on improving relations with the Oneida Nation. We have Paul DeMaine, who founded News from Indian Country. He managed Winona LaDuke's 2000 campaign for vice presidency, and he's the chair of Honor the Earth. To show exactly how voting maps of Native American communities in Wisconsin have been gerrymandered, we have Bill Whitford, who was the first named plaintiff in Gill v. Whitford, the United States Supreme Court case involving the constitutionality of partisan gerrymandering. Bill Whitford is Professor Emeritus of the UW-Madison School of Law. Bill, would you please walk us through what happened to our voting maps in 2011?
Thank you very much, Justice. Gerrymandering is a process is a term that's described to a redistricting, a legislative districting, that is intentionally designed to disadvantage certain groups and advantage other groups. Wisconsin is famous for lots of things, but infamous for having adopted a redistricting scheme in 2011, effective in 2012. That is one of the most partisan gerrymanders in the history of the country, disadvantaging various people, Democrats in general, and as we'll see, Native Americans in the Northeast Wisconsin area. So this is a map that just illustrates how much difference the redistricting scheme made. We have on the left the distribution of Democratic and Republican seats in 2008, and on the right, the same in 2016. Now, there's some differences in those elections, but mostly the statewide vote for Democrats and Republicans were similar, close. But you can see much more blue on the left than there is on the right, much more red on the right. That is primarily due to just redrawing district lines in a way that advantaged Republicans and disadvantaged Democrats. This is a map that shows the location of Native American communities around the state of Wisconsin. Okay, so here's northeast Wisconsin, excuse me. The left map, again, is under the previous districting scheme. The right map is under the one currently in effect, adopted in 2011. You can see here in northeast Wisconsin, excuse me, what a difference the redistricting made in which states are Democratic and how many Democratic seats and how many Republican seats there are. Let me just say a word about how this is accomplished technically. It's done through a process called packing and cracking. And in packing, the term packing refers to an attempt to create a district that has just lots and lots of voters, we'll say 75% and up, who vote for a party that you want to disadvantage. And the reason you put in this case, Democrats, the reason you put all kinds of Democrats in one district is because all those votes above 50% are essentially wasted. You're putting them all in one district where they elect one Democrat, but that keeps a lot of votes out of neighboring districts. In this map, the obviously packed districts are downtown Green Bay, which is number 90, and it's downtown Appleton and Menasha combined, number 57. Cracking refers to the process of taking other Democrats, but less than a majority of the district, and then overwhelming their votes with Republicans, usually by spreading the district out into rural Republican areas. You can see a number of examples of that. For example, number 6 here, which includes, we'll come back to it, because it includes the Stockbridge-Muncie, but it includes some areas here near Green Bay that are more Democratic, but then it spreads them way out. We can see the same thing here with number 2, number 3, number 5, which includes much of the Oneida Reservation. These are all areas where there are Democratic areas, but then you spread them out into rural areas and overwhelm the Democratic vote so that they're not a majority. Okay, so that's the basic technique of cracking and packing. If we can see the next map, we'll focus particularly on what happened to the Native American tribes. One of the things that happened in this redistricting, this is just the current situation, we don't have the previous one, but on the map, but one of the things that happened in this redistricting is there was no attention paid to keeping Native American communities in a single assembly district so that their vote would have more impact on the outcome of that assembly or district. The Oneida Nation here is divided into 3 different assembly districts. There's number 4 here. There's number 5 here, which is geographically at least much of the United Nation. And there's a small bit up here in number 6. You see the same inattention to keeping Native Americans in a single assembly district, a particular tribe, up here with the Menominee Nation and the adjacent Stockbridge-Muncie Nation, which historically were all in one assembly district, giving that assembly district a higher percentage of the vote was Native American. Here we have most of the Menominee Nation put it District 36, a small part right down here, which is located in Shawano County and is called, I believe, Middle Village, is separated from the rest of the Menominee Nation and put in assembly district number 6 along with the Stockbridge from Muncie. So that breaks up the Menominee Nation into 2 assembly districts, and it eliminates the unity there was between the Menominee and the Stockbridge, Muncie in previous redistrictings. I think that's all I have to say about the maps, and I'll turn the microphone over.
Thank you, Bill. So although this isn't discussed much, Native American communities have definitely been impacted by gerrymandering. Some have been separated, like the Menominee and Stockbridge-Muncie communities, who historically had always been in one district. And Oneida has been outright divided. It's in 3 separate assembly districts now. So now that we have some context, we'll get our panelists' take on what's happened. The first question I'd like to ask is, how has gerrymandering impacted your community's well-being, exercise of rights, or water and land? A pretty open-ended question. Patti, you're a Menominee. Would you start this off?
One of the things that people, when they're really lucky, they get to pick where they want to live. And I was one of the lucky people. I actually got to move and live where I wanted to live. And oftentimes people pick a community to live in because your values are the same. And what gerrymandering has done is split our community. For instance, one of the top issues in water rights for the Menominee tribe is our ancestral land at the mouth of the Menominee River, where they're putting in a mine, and tribe opposes it. We're lucky that we do have an assemblyman that is concerned about that for us and has advocated. The Menominees that live in Middle Village, they have a different assembly person, and that assembly person isn't saying anything. So it impacts our water, the water, and particularly our ancestral land. Our creation story starts from the mouth of the Menominee River. So we're very concerned about that. And I know one of the reasons I moved to this community, the Menominee Reservation, is because the people here share the same values that I have. That's why I picked the community. And also it's home.
Thank you, Patti. That's really powerful. Yeah, I know in Wisconsin, we had a moratorium that prevented mining here in the state for decades. And after these gerrymandered maps were put in place, the state legislature lifted that moratorium. And that likely wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for these gerrymandered maps. I'll put the same question to Joe Miller. Joe, how has gerrymandering affected your community's well-being, your exercise of rights, or your land and water?
It's kind of a tough question. We've been dealing with these assemblymen, like the map had showed prior to, almost 20 years ago, we had a different assembly district. Now we're in a different one. All across Indian country, especially our relationship with our brothers and sisters of Menominees, very, very close relationship. What affects one of us, what affects one affects the other in many different aspects and areas, not just geographically, but many of our families. So I understand and I appreciate Patti's comments, having stood myself on the banks of the Menominee River some years ago and seeing, just seeing that. And in Stockbridge, we can go down to Madison and we can walk the halls of Congress down there and meet with Gary Tauken, who's the current assemblyman. And I think Jeff Mursaw is their assembly person, correct? And I know both of these individuals. I know both of these guys. I've been dealing and working with them for many years. But dealing with them and then how they deal within their own party is two different things. They like to tell you what you want to hear, but when it comes down to voting on certain issues, the proof's in the pudding. With that in mind, thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Next, we have Lance Kelly, who lives and works on the Oneida Reservation. Lance, how has gerrymandering impacted your community's well-being, their exercise of rights, or their land and water?
Well, before I answer that question, I just want to say, I don't speak on behalf of Oneida. I'm not a tribal member. I come from this a little different perspective. Yes, I'm married in. I've been here for 25 years. Taught in Oneida for a long time. A lot of people just think I'm Oneida. Traditional way, married in, so part of that. But, coming, from that perspective, then also being a Hobart taxpayer, and that's hard for me to say that, but I did. And then being a instructor at NWTC, which is actually located on the boundaries of Oneida. So I come from this in, several different ways. And just as, and I'm not sure everybody knows, a disclaimer, he was a former student of mine just recently, so he asked me to be part of this. So I appreciate that. But so I actually reached out to my friends in Oneida. None of them really work for the tribe anymore. I was on the phone several times and, just talking to the former lobbyists, some people up in the government area, and then the former lobbyist who was for Oneida, but he passed away a couple of years ago. So, I haven't really been involved too much with Oneida. But to answer that question, definitely from many different levels. Once again, going back to that bio, I haven't thought about running. I did run, I was 11, 12 years ago. I was approached by several people in the community to run, and part of it was because of this gerrymandering and, trying to get a Native person on here in the village of Hobart. I'm not going to go into too much in that story, but definitely, so personal and professionally, the impact of gerrymandering has definitely, been here, will continue to be here. We're really looking at 2 districts, 4 and 5, even though 6 is there. There's probably not too many people that live. I was looking at the map, just where is that line? And, it's a very, very narrow part at the tip of the reservation. I was trying to think myself who lives up there, and I probably just pick a handful of people. But, really, but the key part of that is the impact that it has and it continue to have. And, as we progress through here, I'd like to, from a national level too, there's so much going on out there with the census, for those that don't know, they're going to cut it short this year. I mean, with COVID, you got so many different issues that's going on that's going to impact Native in the country, and in many different levels, and it's not positive. And talking to my friend last night from NARF, they're just working. They have several. He said 10 cases that are dealing with Native voting right now, and suppression of that. So I come from from local, but also more of a national perspective. So I'll just leave it at that right now.
Great, thank you, Lance. Speaking of taking this from a wider perspective, we have Paul Demain, who founded and helped run News from Indian Country, which didn't focus on one reservation, but many. Paul, how would you say gerrymandering has affected tribal nations?
Right. Well, I wanted to mention that I think if NARF has 10 active cases now that they're litigating across the country, they've probably dealt with already more than that, maybe 100 in the last 10, 15 years. And there's certainly a lot of other cases that need to be taken place. But what I see is not only a negative impact on the potential contributions of American Indians in the reservations in Wisconsin and other places because of the current gerrymandering that took place in the state of Wisconsin under the Republicans 10 years ago when they controlled both the Assembly, the Senate, and the governorship. But historic trends. When you look at the Oneida Reservation, it's divided in half between 2 counties, which means that right away you defuse the potential vote coming off that reservation in either county for county supervisory seats. Because of that, they're in at least 2 different, they're actually in probably 4 or 5 different municipal districts at the township, city level as well, which means that, again, you're breaking off chunks of the reservation population and diffusing the potential vote. Another historic example might be the Lakota Ojibwe Reservation, which in the early 1900s fought off the condemnation of the Chippewa flowage here in Sawyer County. And because of it, the state of Wisconsin dissolved the township of Reserve and split up the territory into 6 different voting districts. So when it comes to township boards and everything, the reservation population in each one of those 6 townships represents about 20% of the vote. It's not impossible to get elected, but it certainly diffuses the initiatives of tribal government in the local community. And so there's lots of examples. We heard Mr. Whitford talk a little bit about the impact of gerrymandering in the Northeast District. Well, they took the 7th Congressional District, of which I reside in, and it starts in Superior, Wisconsin. And we were getting some sign distribution stuff going, and someone from Monroe County called up and says, how can we get some signs? And I thought, geez, Monroe County's about halfway down the state. It's actually in the Sparta, Wisconsin area. So I had to look at the map and to see what they did in terms of regrouping the districts and taking Stevens Point and Eau Claire university districts and manufacturing districts, union districts, farmers and everything, and squeezing those populations out. In order to draw the map, they drew it from northern Wisconsin down to just north of Sparta, Wisconsin. I was talking to the lady there and says, yeah, well, we live on one side of the street. The district's only on one side of the street. And there's this little chunk that comes down for miles and miles and miles. That's how refined the process was in which they were identifying Republican or Democratic voters. There is some dangerous to what the Republicans did, because if the Democrats were ever able to overcome that numerical edge that they have to preserve these districts as heavy Democratic districts and heavy Republican districts, with a majority of the districts being Republican control, if those districts would change over, the Democrats might have that same advantage in the long run as well. So it sets up a scenario that is off balance and unfair. And so we don't have the indigenous communities grouped together with proper interests. We have a district here in the 7th Congressional District, and the 29th Senate District, which I ran in several years ago, starts in Sealy north of here and goes to Wittenberg, Wisconsin. So it's like about 180 miles, 3.5, 4 hours to get a little chunk of that district, whereas the majority of the district is, used to be at least forestry, tourism. And usually what they tried to do in grouping people together is they tried to group those people together that had common interests. You had indigenous people on reservations, those districts were voted, they had a chance to vote an indigenous candidate into office. And so we've lost that capability. It's not that it can't be overcome, but it can't be done by the balance of power that the Native community owns. And so in a district where we might represent 10 or 15%, we can flip the district to the red or blue on either side, but it makes it that much more difficult, because now the Menominees are outside of our district. In the Senate district, Lakota in the 29th is all by itself. Bad River and Red Cliff now remain in the other Senate district, and St. Croix was taken out. And so it simply diffused the ability to impact the political process and to elect potential indigenous candidates, and to impact people who cater to the indigenous community, who might be more willing to listen to and forward the agenda they might have. So it's been detrimental and negative historically, and certainly in the last 10 years, that distance between fair and equitable has widened.
Wow, thank you, Paul. A lot of historical context, more of a broader view there. So I'll move on to our second question here. What impact would fair voting maps drawn in a nonpartisan manner have on your community? Patti, I know you're up in Menominee. Would you start out with this question?
Thank you, Justice. I think Paul kind of said it in his past answer, in that the way we're all separated and everything, it's very, very hard to elect an indigenous person to represent us. And not that I have the same values as all indigenous people, but it would be nice to have somebody that would have an ear to our issues. For instance, one of the things that the College of Menominee Nation, for which I teach at, has tried to do for the last probably 14 years is try to get tuition money for non-Native students. We get tuition money for Native students, but not non-Native students. And about 20% of our student population is non-Native. In some ways, that's really good, because I think it has helped our communities become better, having working together and having non-Native students at the college. But it has placed a financial hardship on the college. If we had Indigenous people, they would be more open to that common interest, because we don't only educate Menominees at the College of Menominee Nation. We service a lot of Oneida students, Stockbridge, Muncie, Mohican students, some Potawatomi students, some Ho-Chunk students, and then non-Native students. We're a regional college. So I think Paul answered it best in that we need people to represent us that understand our values. Thank you. Joanna?
Yeah, thank you, Patti. Next, I'll ask the question to Joe Miller. I know you're near Patti. She's on the Menominee Reservation. You are out in Stockbridge, Muncie. How would nonpartisan drawn voting maps affect your community?
First of all, my apologies in my first proper introduction. First of all, it's very important in Indian country, and I'd like to first thank you, the host, and all my fellow panel members. It's very important for introductions and acknowledgement there that we do so. My name's Joe Miller, and I've lived on a Stockbridge, Muncie in the same house for the last 60 years. Roots are very deep, but I've been around the block a little bit. And so with that in mind, with perspective to the question, I'm going to kind of do an end around to try to answer that question. In Western Shawano County, where we are, northwestern Shawano County, we have just immediately to the west of us in the next township over in the township of Almond, there are 4 CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, large mega farms. One is, if not the largest, the second largest in the state, with over 15,000 animal units. When we as a tribe, address environmental concerns, those environmental concerns about the water, the air, the ground, and the potential effect that those operations have on the environment, when we go to Madison and speak to our representative, I'm sorry, but our representative's father owns a CAFO in Eastern Shawano County. So we have environmental issues there now, and we are separate. The Menominees have the same thing. And I'm trying to think back prior to 2000, back in 2002, if we were in the same assembly district and Senate district, maybe that would combine some voices for a stronger voice. I've talked to Gary Tauken, I've talked to Jeff Merson numerous times, but it's kind of hard, and it's kind of a hypocrisy with an environmental interest such as what is present and threatening our groundwater, our surface water, to go to our assemblymen. So with that in mind, that is how this current district has affected Stockbridge, Muncie. So, it's Indian country, and I've lived here on a west branch of the Red River and swam in it ever since I was knee-high to, Geppetto. So it's how do I say it? I mean, it's a concern, a drastic, devastating concern as to what the potential to the groundwater, not only to our people, but to all of, you got to think of all the surrounding residents of those factory farms and their health and their consumption of safe drinking water. So those things need to be mitigated, and they need a strong voice to act on the environmental interest, which I don't know as if we're hearing or not. Thank you. I say Anishik, which is thank you in Mohican. Anishik.
Yeah, great answer, Joe. Yeah, gerrymandering is definitely one of those umbrella issues that covers all kinds of different issues. In order to get anything we want done, we need fair elections, and you can't have fair elections without fair maps. So I agree with what you said completely. Next, we'll ask the question to Lance Kelly, who's out in Oneida. Lance, how do you think things would be different with voting maps that are drawn in a nonpartisan manner?
Well, I'll try to be positive here. First of all, I would like to say, around Indian country, the primaries were this past Tuesday. A lot of Native candidates did win their primaries. In Kansas, 4 Native women won their primaries. Now, that's the first step. Arizona, they saw some great results in Washington State. So there is some, positivity with this. The other flip side, I just have a hard time, looking if it's ever going to be a fair map. I mean, right now, districts are drawn either by the state legislators or commissions, which are, nonpartisan. There's just a handful of states out there that have allowed that. Iowa, California, Colorado, maybe a few more. Because once a party, and that could be a Democrat or a Republican, gets them, in office and power, they're not going to release that power. I mean, that's just what it is. And it's really hard to create those fair maps, in those districts. So I'm hoping for the best, but I just don't see that, especially what I was mentioning earlier about what's happening as we speak right now with the census, state laws going around this country. I mean, I just have a hard time looking at it and trying to see, some positive out of this. We're facing some tough roads ahead. I mean, the gentleman at the beginning that talked about 2010, 2020, I mean, that's just reality there. I don't think that's even going to get better from the next census coming up here, and I'll be unfortunately showing more articles about this, to students like Justice, and it can be a struggle. So, here in Oneida, like I said, we're basically in District 5. Steineke, he's been around for a long time, 10 plus years. He's been in my classroom, and just talk about various topics. He has a working relationship with Oneida. I'm not sure how that is right now. I mean, they have those relationships, but that still doesn't make change. So that's just what it is right now. So I hope.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned the commission's tasked with drawing voting maps that don't favor any party. Right now, a commission is being formed in Wisconsin, the People's Maps Commission, with that very task, drawing voting maps that don't favor any party. Next year, those maps will be presented to the legislature, and which hopefully next year we'll get. Next, I'll put the question to Paul Demain. Paul, how do you see nonpartisan voting maps affecting tribal communities?
Well, first of all, it provides a much more better groundwork for holding particular candidates accountable. So, for example, when there used to be, I think, 4 Indian reservations in the 87th Assembly District of Wisconsin, and they could cut St. Croix and Lac-Courte out, it meant that the assembly person in that district only had 2 tribal governments to deal with rather than 4, and half the population of Native Americans that they previously had in their district. I think when you have a strong constituency and an interest group there, that it allows for better accountability of the particular candidate, because now both these candidates, one of them is responsive, that used to be in our district, and the new assembly person is less responsive in terms of legislation because of the margins that they're able to win by. In some cases, they practically don't have to pay attention to the agenda because they know in our particular case at Lac-Courte in northwestern Wisconsin that probably 80% of the votes cast are going to be on the Democratic ballot. That's just the historic fact of voting in the indigenous community in Northwest Wisconsin. But when you begin paring down the citizens who are voting against you, you don't have to pay as much attention to it. So in some ways, the gerrymandering may have allowed the Indian community to force an education upon some of those politicians, more of them. There's a theory to that. We put one or two rednecks on the committee that drafted legislation, the American Indian Legislative Study Committee at the time, because they came from districts that had indigenous people, but they weren't too bright about what they were talking about or how they were representing the treaties, the sovereignty that tribes have retained, the concern for environmental resources, the concern for treaty resources in the ceded territory. And so we put them on that panel to educate them. And so the gerrymandering maybe have scattered our political influence in northern Wisconsin, which means that maybe those individuals have become more educated on it. But what's good is when you have a strong advocate, someone who knows that in part their election is dependent on the indigenous community turning out. And so we represent 10 or 15% of the population. We have a balance of power. We can reject one Democratic candidate for a Republican candidate when the politics of the situation forces that. But when you divide that in half, you divide that power. So again, the first question was about is how were we diminishing power? And in this is what could happen if, for example, the 7th Congressional District encompassed all the reservations of northern Wisconsin, including Wausau, that has a fairly large tribal population and everything in between. There's a general interest there, and your politicians have to pay attention to those constituencies. They have to become educated. They have to know about treaty rights. They have to be able to go in there. Those are some of the individuals that saved tribal funding in the CARES Act, because there were some individuals that says, my constituency will unelect me if I don't carry the ball to Washington, D.C. and get tribal government funding in the CARES Stimulus Act. And it was put in at a time when the White House was saying they didn't want that tribal government funding. And so it bore political pressure from that side of the particular aisle, which was good. And that's what politics is about, raw political power. So gerrymandering in a fair way. Constitutional rights to vote are constitutional rights, but if you can vote and it's meaningless in terms of the response, then voting becomes meaningless. If people say, look, we can vote as much as we can, but we have no impact on the legislative process, either at state or congressional level, or even at the township level, why should we do it? Okay, so it takes its toll on voter participation and citizen participation in a group that already fought for those rights, starting in 1950s when, Hillary Walker told me he was denied the right to vote until he argued he was a serviceman and everything else, and demanded his right to vote as a veteran. And we've seen improvement in the last 75 years, but there needs to be a concentrated effort, I think, to get these fair maps in a way that allows a consensus of the community and arguments on the floor of the assembly, rather than people then saying, oh, we've just got a majority, we can just do whatever we want. We don't need to talk to the 49% or the 46%. And in Wisconsin, you have these statistical data that shows that in the last election, a certain percentage of the vote, I forgot what it was, 55 to 63% of the popular vote went to Democratic candidates, and yet on the other side, 63% of the districts went to Republicans. That's unfair. In a country where we ought to be looking at fairness, we need to rebuild that confidence in the system. So a good map with ungerrymandered districts is going to get better confidence and integrity to the voting process, and it means people feel comfortable participating in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Yeah, some really good points in that. In 2018, the Wisconsin State Assembly race, Republicans received about 46% of the popular vote, and they received 63 actually, seats in the state assembly, 63 of the 99. So that's due to the maps that we showed earlier on this presentation. And this, like Lance said, happens with both Republicans and Democrats, that we really don't need this either way. Completely skews the votes of the people, whether it's Republicans or Democrats voting this. I'll move on to our next question here. In what ways is it important that the Native American vote is fairly heard? And would you elaborate on the importance of the Native American vote? Patti, would you start off with this one?
I teach American government. And for the last 17 years. And I try to make it relevant so that my students will vote. It's important that they do. Whether it be in local elections, the national election, even tribal elections, because students will express issues to me. And one of my questions to them always, did you vote? And they look at me like I'm nuts. So I try to encourage my students to vote by making it relevant, trying to persuade them that their voice counts. I think recent events in the United States that minority voices want to be heard. And how we express that as citizens, whether it be in our tribal nations or in the state or the United States, is to exercise that vote. Because they're, like Paul had brought up, Hillary Waka, Marine, fought for this country in World War II, couldn't vote. And you look at history and the amendments that were added and who was added when they could vote, and people have no clue how important it is to vote. So I try to make it relevant to my students, tell them if you don't vote, don't complain because you didn't exercise your voice in the vote. Well, Anna.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very good points. Yeah, people fought very hard for the Native American right to vote. Next, we'll put the question to Joe Miller. Joe, in what ways is it important that the Native American vote is heard fairly? And would you speak on the importance of the Native American vote as well?
Very good. Anishik again. Recently in one of my elections there at the county board level, an elder lady that lives right down the road from where I'm sitting right at this point in time, and I was going around and asking people, just to get out and vote, telling them what I was running for. And she finally agreed. I had to drive her to the polling place. Her comment to me was, Joe, now if I register to vote, I damn well better not be called for jury duty or I'm going to come after you. A little humor from an elder. But it says something. Whether or not it's a reluctance, I can't echo what was already said. There's no need to because it was said so eloquently. But whether it's a reluctance or what, in some families that they don't want this potential to be called into government service or this, but the young kids, on a school board, we're a non-partisan the school board, the county government, and the tribal council, all my years of elected service, over 30, has been on 3 boards that are nonpartisan. You do not have to declare political affiliation to serve on any of those. And I'm dang proud of that, because I'm not a card-carrying member of any political party, nor will I ever be. Because, man, if we could get back to moderates on both sides of the aisle, that people that could sit down and understand and rationalize and reason things out. But now it is so drastically to one side or the other that I understand what Mr. Kelly was saying. It's going to take a long time for those divisions to heal, whether or not they ever will. But we have to start somewhere, and we have to start educating our kids. It may take a generation. And start educating our children, because I'm getting up there. Not quite as gray as Mr. Whitford there, but I'm getting close. So we got to educate these children, and those are the future, not only in Indian country, but in all of our country. Starting off with the littlest ones and expressing to them how important it is to be civic-minded, be involved. If you see something, hear something that you disagree with, you say something. And on the Shawano County Board, there's 27 of us. I believe I'm the only Indian on the Shawano County Board, but I'm on that board for a reason. I'm on that board for a reason, and that is to go and, to change. And that's a tough nut to crack. I got a lot of respect for my fellow board members. One of them has been on the county board for 46 years. So respectfully, I always kid everybody at 62, I'm one of the younger ones on the county board. In the recent election, there was some more younger people that got elected and replaced some incumbents. So it was a good sign, and it's a start. But the idea and the mindset. So we need forward thinking, and we need these young people, because they are our future. Can't express the importance to all the young people to get involved. That will change. Not only in Indian country, but that will change across the board. So again, nishik to all the people that are participating here today, and to the audience. Thank you very much for your consideration and your time. No.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, I completely agree that voting is making your voice heard. That refusing to vote out of angst, contempt for things that are happening right now, that is basically giving up your voice. Voting is your power.
If I may, just very, very briefly, if I may, and on the map, all of the Middle Village area of the Menominee Indian Reservation lies in Shawano County. There's a significant population there, but in a township of Red Springs, which that Middle Village is in, I think there's Patti can probably express it a heck of a lot better, but it's my sense that when I went there early on and met with the leadership in Middle Village, we vote in our tribal elections. We won't go to Shawano County and vote in theirs. That's what I wanted to say. So, but now they have an Indian representative, and maybe things will change.
Joel, that really is true. They are giving the Menominee people that go to vote in Red Springs given really bad treatment.
Yes.
And when you're treated badly, you just avoid the situation. Any human being would. Hopefully that will change. We know that on the poll workers now, there's somebody that's from the College of Menominee Nation that's a poll worker. And she wants to make sure that all people get treated fairly when they go to vote. So,
Yeah, that's really great to hear. Yeah, I really do hope that changes on its way. So next, we'll put the question to Lance Kelly. Would you speak on the importance of the Native American vote and it being heard fairly?
Well, just like to, I don't want to repeat too much, and I think Joe did a great job explaining some of the stuff. Education, definitely, being an educator, lifelong educator for myself, doing this, every day at some level, in the classroom with, young students, majority of people like you, Justin, and I appreciate, the work you're doing. I'm getting more interested and more involved myself in this discussion and this topic. So definitely that's a big part, and on the pod, with the young people, they are doing different things. I think the social media plays a big part that's different. I mean, look what happened at the Tulsa, the Trump rally. I mean, TikTok, they basically took the president down, so they did their own way. They'll figure this out. Having an 18-year-old daughter, I mean, she was part of that. She's active. She got to vote in the tribal election last couple weeks ago, her first time. So that's a start. And I think that's a critical part, in all of this. And just trying to, as Patti said, our students, seeing their interests. And, I always do a little activity in my class. The first day of class is basically rate yourself 0 to 10, your interest in politics. 9 out of 10 of them are zeros and ones, okay? I think a few were always on that 10. And then the last day of class, I do it again. And there's a couple that, hey, they went from 1 to 4. And, so that's a positive. That's always if nothing else, I'm doing something in that classroom. So I think that's just we're going to have to just day by day, and with this coming election, I mean, like I said, voting is critical, and I can't just stress that enough. So I'm just going to leave it and let kind of Paul finish it up and his good word. So, Mado, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lance. And like you said, we'll pass this off to Paul. And what's your take on this, Paul?
Well, I find it interesting that 53 of the 70 some counties in the state of Wisconsin have passed resolutions asking for fair maps. And I think that's the bottom line to this entire story. During my lifetime, I believe in participating in the political process. I've registered more Republicans than I care to register, but I register voters, whether they're Democratic, Socialist, Green parties, whatever party they may be, because I think that it's important to participate in the political process. And so when I was in the governor's office, the starting point was not working with the Democrats that were in power throughout the Assembly and the Senate and the governor's office. We had a governor at that time that said, Paul, we're going to go out and we're going to pass a bill on law enforcement agency cooperative programs for reservations, in a model program at that time in the 1980s. And the starting point was to find people on the other side of the aisle to participate in the process, because coming to a consensus provides for a bill that serves the better will of the United States, of the state of Wisconsin, and our districts that we come from. If all indigenous people in the state of Wisconsin voted, they hold the balance of power. There's been 2 elections. Trump was voted in by 22,000 votes. I think Kerry won the state of Wisconsin by 11,000 votes, meaning that the 25 to 30,000 Native American voters who participated in those elections may have been the balance of power between the Republicans and Democrats in those 2 political positions in the world. The balance of power is what I have always relied upon. Whether we sign up people to vote on the Republican side or the Democratic side or Green Party members or whatever it is. When we come together for an issue and we can tilt things to the right or the left or get something done because they had that balance of power, we're more powerful than either political party or all the parties together because we hold the balance of power in our communities. And so voting is that much more important, and fair elections are important. I don't care if this gerrymandering had been done by Democrats. If it's unfair and it's not right. It's morally not the right thing to do in this country. So we need to get back to somewhere where people feel an obligation to have to find a consensus on the Assembly and Senate floor and in the governor's office. They have to go out and they just can't operate the country with 40% of the country not even voting at all. And then the other 60%, 49% over here, 50% over there, meaning that, 31% of the voters who do vote are controlling the political agenda because gerrymandering makes it safe for a certain political power to do whatever it darn well pleases, including seizing power from the governor over healthcare concerns and other elements. And it's unfair whether it's done by Democrats, Republicans, independents, socialists, communists, or wherever they come from. So I've always come from the spot that the political process is really important. That in the case of Middle Village, where they're treated poorly now, in Red Springs, well, the Coudray was treated pretty nasty at one time, and we signed up 500 voters, and we voted the people out of office who were treating us poorly. So I don't know what Middle Village has in terms of population, and I know that some of our citizens are rather reluctant to participate in what a lot of people consider to be their process. But their process funds healthcare. Their process funds our schools. Their process funds our housing. Their process funds domestic violence prevention. Their funds our roads. Their funds, our funds, the funds that come through that process. And if you get involved at the township level and the county level and the state level and the national politics, there are committees that guide those decisions. And that's why the political process is so necessary. But it has to be fair and equitable. And when you gerrymander districts to gain power and to hang on to it, it's morally, it's ethically wrong. And that's what the people in political power at the time did. They did something that was morally and ethically wrong, and it needs to be corrected. And so while the Republicans still control the Senate and Assembly, we have a Democratic governor who's going to sign on to something that was fairer than it was when it was drawn 10 years ago in secret, where they identified individual households as Republican or Democrat and picked and choose. In my district, I was campaigning on a street. Someone says, no, I'm not in your district. I'm in someone else's district. The next house was back in my district. The house across the street was in someone else's district, and the houses facing the ones in my district were in someone else's. It was confusing, and it was wrong to do it the way they did it. They need to do better on behalf of people, and certainly the indigenous community, which already starts from behind, we're only a small percentage of the impact of those policies. And so when we were left out in the greater citizenship participatory process in the past, this just kind of says, look, every time we step forward, we get pushed back a little bit. We step forward, but history says that in the long run, we will prevail. We're going to get better maps this time around. We may get some tribal people elected in those new Assembly and Senate districts in northern Wisconsin in the future, and that's going to be history in the making. So, fair maps.
Yeah, I'm all for it. You mentioned how close a lot of elections come down to. I know in the 2016 presidential election in Wisconsin, it came down to about 1%. Same with the 2018 gubernatorial race that was won by about 1%.
If I could add one little thing, we just had an election in the 7th Congressional District with a candidate that is a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation. And if the same percentages had occurred 4 years ago during the national elections, the Wisconsin would have gone in a different direction. So all of this is so important because the tribal community participates in it and can move it to the right or left at times, and sometimes it's fantastic. We've got several congressional representatives now that are from indigenous communities, and it's going to make a difference in terms of how legislation is responded to in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, Native people really do have some serious voting power here in Wisconsin. We don't have accurate numbers just yet because the 2020 census is still being taken, but it's pretty safe to say that we have over 100,000 Native people in the state. So we have the power, we just need to use it. Special thanks to all of our panelists who came on and shared their stories. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I think this has been a great discussion. Yoko, Nugiwa.